Most mole hunts or many mole hunts end in a very unsatisfying fashion. It is very hard to actually prove that someone has committed espionage, and there are cases in the States where people have kind of been more or less run out of the service because everybody knows they've done something, but you can't quite prove it.
Kim Philby, anyone?
Kim Philby, anyone?
Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you.
Right, this is London Station calling. Tim Shipman here with you from Sunday Times Towers with the beautiful backdrop, as you can see. Joined today by David McCloskey, ex-CIA analyst, multiple award-winning spy writer. Welcome back to Spybrary, David.
Tim, it's great to be back, and I'm glad that you find yourself in a proper interrogation center by the look of your background. So this is a perfect vibe for our conversation here.
It's all a bit NKVD 1947, but on the upside, there's no blood up the walls. So,
that's true. That's true.
Yeah. David McCloskey, I mean, the first time we did this, you were this up-and-coming guy who'd spent years toiling over a book, and we were all very excited about it, and we wanted to tell the world, and you're a bit of a, sort of breakthrough man. The second time you were agonizing over your sophomore challenge, the Tricky Second album, which it sounded like was a total agony, though I thought it was probably the best book of the year, Moscow X. And now here we are, and you're not really just our David McCloskey anymore. You're now a sort of international megastar, writer of op-eds in the world's newspapers, international expert on espionage. You've got a new podcast, you've got a new book. Thanks for coming back to see your old chums.
I'm delighted to be here. I was actually met a couple Spybrarians at some of the talks in London over the past few days, and it's a delight. I mean, this crew is special, and I think it's a place and sort of a community unlike any other. So I'm delighted to be back. Be back talking to you. It's wonderful.
Well, we like to think you're sort of one of us writing kind of English-style spy novels, but of course there's lots of Americans writing English-style spy novels now, so we'll grab you and Ilana Berry and Paul Vidic.
That's right.
Whoever else wants to come along as well. But just tell us quickly about the podcast before we get on to the book.
Sure.
You've joined forces with who for our American audience?
So yeah, I've joined forces with the former BBC security correspondent Gordon Carrera, who is my intrepid co-host on The Rest is Classified. And we're basically doing, narrative kind of style storytelling in our podcast, looking at spy stories of sort of past and present, not the future yet. And the concept is basically that Gordon and I have a conversation. Ideally, it's very much like, we're sort of having a pint and, the listener is invited in. We're talking about that story. It could be 40 minutes and done, or it could be a 6-parter. And the idea is we tell the authentic story and get into the actual, sort of nuts and bolts of the tradecraft, as well as all the kind of geopolitics of it. And we're having a ton of fun with it. We've done some episodes on, just to give you a sense of kind of the range we're looking at. We've done some episodes on the CIA and MI6 teaming up in 1953 to overthrow the Iranian government, all the way up to
classic of the genre.
A classic, yes. Definitely earned me a bit of ire from some Persian friends who still feel it deeply 70 plus years later. And then we've just recently cut, it's not out yet, a 6-parter on Edward Snowden. And so we're doing all kinds of stories.
And Shane and I were talking before we came on air here, but I think, this is one of the top podcasts in the UK already. I think I saw it at number 2 yesterday, behind your stablemate, The Rest is History. And for those that aren't familiar with this is Goalhanger Productions, which is run by the former England footballer Gary Lineker, but he's got a hugely successful political one, a history one, and now so you guys doing espionage is a big deal. And I think the vibe between the two of you it's already, as you say, it's like a couple of old pals who just happen to know a lot about this stuff, having a chat.
That's great. Yeah, that's what we're going for, precisely. Yeah.
And then you've done a few sort of emergency kind of immediate ones with your Syrian expertise. I think you jumped in when Assad fell, and that was so you're going to keep doing those as well, presumably?
Yeah. Well, we'll kind of do that on a case-by-case basis. We did one right after Assad fell, as you said, and we did one last week on TikTok, of all things, not really focused on the ban in the U.S. or sort of, prognosticating on where that's headed, but kind of turning the issue on its head a bit and talking about if we were, officers of the Chinese MSS, their sort of CIA or MI6, how might we think about TikTok as part of this kind of arsenal of cyber and sort of cognitive warfare from an espionage standpoint? So we'll do that stuff occasionally, but the idea is that the bread and butter is really just kind of the actual stories, spy stories. That'll be most of what we cover on the pod.
Just tell me quickly then. I mean, obviously you were first known for Damascus Station, which is, immensely kind of a book that took you to Damascus. You obviously knew a lot about it because that had been your kind of specialist subject when you were an analyst. I mean, what was that like watching him go?
I have to say I was following it very closely on social media like everybody else. That, I guess in the States, it was this late Saturday evening. At some point when it seemed like the rebels were getting to Damascus, I started letting the whiskeys sort of fly because it looked like it was going to happen. But I was, of course, like everybody, kind of thinking that there would be a final showdown in the capital and that it would be bloody and awful and, very uncertain if this rebel, HTS-led sort of offensive was going to work. And when it became clear that it did and that he had just up and fled, I sort of emerged from my whiskey-induced, coma the next morning and thought I hadn't been hopeful about Syria 15 years. And I think there is and it continues to be some, sort of cautious optimism that is actually warranted, which I can't even believe I'm saying about this country. And I still feel that now. So I'm very hopeful that, the interim government will be, I think, better than what came before. I think there is a very real possibility of that. And, the Damascus Station, part of the dedication, in addition to dedicating the book to my lovely wife, was to Syria and her people for a future better than the past. And I think I have some shred of hope that is actually a possibility and that Syrians have a chance to build it, which I think is very cool. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the future now.
But some of those questions about the new government that you would have once have had about the opposition when you were analysing things, can we trust this group or that group, or who actually is really in charge?
Absolutely. And it's actually pretty amazing how similar a lot of the big questions are now that we were trying to answer back in 2011 and 2012. Like they're very similar questions in many respects. And we will, time will tell, but I do think there are some sort of reasons to be optimistic about Jelani, about HTS. Not that there's going to be a Jeffersonian democracy in Syria, but that we might end up with a government that is more representative, less brutal, and frankly more legitimate than the one that came before.
I'm always struck when these sort of moments happen very dramatically. You think that, Afghanistan and the Taliban retake over was very quick. I mean, I grew up watching Ceausescu on, Christmas Eve or whenever it was. And these regimes, which you chronicled so brilliantly in Damascus Station, have this sort of total hold that's partly based on security and partly based on kind of a psychology of control.
Yes.
But when it goes, my God, it can go fast. And intelligence agencies don't seem very good at kind of working out when that might happen.
No. I actually think you hit on the psychological component, which I think is really important to understanding these kind of phenomena, because you were essentially dealing with a situation in which, and I actually think the same dynamic was at play when protests started in Syria in 2011. The way that Syrians described the change that occurred that spring was this wall of fear, as they described it in their own minds, fell. And it happened almost simultaneously for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people all around the country. It happens all at once. And it is not that it's I think, an intelligence failure to miss that. I actually think it's not possible to forecast it, period. And so I think a similar dynamic was at place today, or, in November, December, with the Assad regime, its military, its security services, its militias, where you had all of these, I guess, troublesome dynamics from the standpoint of the regime. I think many of those institutions had hollowed out. They were fabulously corrupt. They'd become deeply sectarian. There were these long-term trends that I think intelligence agencies, including CIA, probably saw. But that point where, ordinary soldiers, militiamen, conscripts just decide to sort of flee and pack up and go is not predictable, because it's a psychological sort of wave that's happening within the span of, days, if not hours. And that's exactly what happened in the first couple of weeks of December.
So you obviously got your teeth into all this nonfiction stuff now. I mean, those who know Gordon Carrera know he's written a lot of well-acclaimed books on modern intelligence operations. Have you got a taste at all for this, David? Do you kind of have a penchant to try a bit of Ben McIntyre-style nonfiction as well?
I honestly know. I'm having too much fun being able to make shit up. So it's probably not something I'm going to dip my toes into at any point in the near future. I'll leave that to Gordon and others. Quite honestly, I mean, the idea of writing a nonfiction book to me seems extremely daunting and exhausting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I know. And I mean, you have written a 4-part trilogy to prove how exhausting it is. So no, I'm gonna leave that to you. I'm gonna leave that to Gordon. I'm gonna stick to stories that I could invent. That at least seems more convenient to me at this point.
Well, let's do what you're doing, frankly.
Yeah.
Now tell us about book 3 then, because I mean, you said it was a lot easier than book 2. I sense there's a sort of lightness of spirit around this book, and there are bits of it that could have been written by Mick Herron or indeed Carl Hyacin when we get to an alligator farm in Florida.
This did come easier. I don't want anyone to think it's too easy, but it's like it was a lot easier than the second one. And
had you always had it in your mind, I'm a spy writer, I need to earn my spurs, I need to do this and that, but I've got to do a mole hunt at some point? It's kind of...
No, I never thought
of spy writer does.
That's true. I mean, I felt, to be honest with you, I never felt that way. I felt that the best way to walk into Proctor and her life and her story was going to be either through a sort of book that's totally like it's taking place in her past, so maybe we go back, sort of like Mick did, where he goes back and talks about, Lamb in Berlin, right? You could sort of do a kind of origin type story with Proctor, or I could do something that by the own sort of logic of the story is backward looking and brings you into her sort of network of friends and enemies and all of that. And I thought the mole hunt, as I was playing around with it to start, to me just had more magic to it. And I actually tried the other way a little bit as I was kind of exploring the world of the story to begin with, and it just didn't work. So for me, the mole hunt was less of like, oh, we all, everyone's got to do one of these, and more of this is the right way to kind of tell Proctor's story.
So when did you work out that Proctor was the sort of your great creation? Because she's there in book 1, she's a great sidekick, but she's not the lead. In book 2, she's kind of becoming more important. She's now, for those who don't know, basically she's called back in a kind of the semi-smiley role to try and find out who's the mole at Langley. And for those who don't know, obviously, tell us about the significance of the 7th floor.
Yeah, well, maybe start there. So the 7th floor, which is the title, it's the executive suite, executive floor in the original headquarters building at Langley. So that is where the director, the deputy director, the heads of the various directorates have their offices and their staffs. And it is kind of I wouldn't say it's necessarily the beating heart of Langley because, actually not that many people work there, but it is the kind of nerve center where the director sits and makes their decisions, right? So that's
what's it like, David?
Did
you get to go up there as an analyst, or was this very off limits?
Yeah. No, especially when Syria blew up, we were up there for a long time. It wasn't always me, but someone from my team, and it was quite often me because it wasn't that large of a team. Went up there every day for like 4 p.m. or 4:30 p.m. with Betrayal to talk about what had happened in Syria that day. So you're up there you can be up there all the time, depending on what's going on in your country. And
what are we talking? Are we talking sort of hideous blank walls like the one behind me, or is it wood paneling and sort of chintz and, what, or does it vary from director to director, what it looks like?
It does vary. I would say, I would almost guarantee you that if we took a film crew in and wandered around, we could find a room that had a backdrop as potentially sinister looking as yours. We could certainly find that somewhere. But the director's office, the director's conference room, the deputy director's area, those do have it's wood paneled. there's a staff that's doing kind of the catering up there. The newspapers and magazines, unlike most other offices at Langley and sort of other, like a dentist's office, are actually not expired there. They are up to date. You will have that day's Post and Times and Wall Street Journal there, but it's not big. It doesn't feel cavernous or anything like that. It feels pretty intimate. I mean, and the director's office is large for an office at CIA. It overlooks the woods right along the Potomac. So it has very lovely views, but it's also not large. You have kind of a small sitting area, a table, and their desk, again, all kind of wood paneled. Not intimidating, though.
I mean, the White House is tiny, and so is Downing Street.
Right.
Exactly. These famous
exactly.
buildings are often
Yes.
quite pokey and odd. It's
yes, the sort of the West Wing, where the Situation Room, that kind of warren of conference rooms, is quite cramped. It's not large. The director's area would very much feel that way. Yeah.
So just give us, for those who haven't dipped in yet or don't know what they're facing, just give us a quick overview of the plot. Proctor's called back, and Sam Joseph from Damascus Station is on hand as well.
Yeah. So. It's of course, very much as we've discussed, it's a mole hunt story, right? So the premise is the Russians have somebody on the 7th floor that they're running. And like, most Proctor stories, this one starts with her, kind of running an operation that goes, ass over heels. Sam gets pulled in by the Russians, arrested, rendered back to Russia. Proctor gets fired in a horribly sort of disgusting fashion. You sort of fast forward a few months, Sam gets traded back, and he comes back to Proctor's doorstep in her retirement in Central Florida, and he's got this explosive secret that there's a bull in the upper reaches of CIA. And so the story from there really is Proctor and Sam building and then working through a short list of suspects who are people that Proctor either has worked with for years and loves, or has worked with for years and despises. And so it is very much a kind of, how does actual counterespionage work? Right? That's one bit of it. There's another piece of this, which I think is, I'm trying to give a bit like Moscow X, but from a different perspective, a dip into the present day spy war between, Moscow in the West and Moscow and Washington. And then really, ultimately, at the human level, it's a story about a group of friends and, a group of friends who, have sort of fallen out over the years, and one of whom has made this, extremely, wild decision to betray not just the service, but also their friends. So it's kind of a story about, I think, the limits of what we can know about other people at some level.
Yeah, and I think there's that famous quote, I've read it in multiple spy books, but about, to betray, you first have to belong. And the point is, these people are betraying Artemis kind of directly. These are friends and colleagues of hers, people she's been in extreme circumstances with in Baghdad and elsewhere. And you bring out that, there's your fixed, closed community, as it were, but it's got to be one of them. So tell the Spybrarians about, we've got some new characters here. We've got the new management at Langley, and then we've got the sort of short list of suspects. Just take us through some of these new characters, one of whom in particular I hope to see more of at some point.
I'll introduce the characters, and I'm curious to hear which one you want to see more of. I think I know, or I have a good
Well,
guess.
I like feisty women, so...
Yeah, so you want more Debs.
I want more Debs.
So all of these people, by the way, are sort of farm classmates of Artemis Proctor, with the exception of the director. So Finn Gosford is the new director of the CIA in this novel. He's sort of a wretched kind of, politico who did have a sort of short career at CIA and then went on to become, sort of take over as a partner at a management consultancy. So I got a little bit of revenge at some of my former past colleagues in that way, which was fun. He is brought in as his deputy director for operations, a woman named Deborah Sweet, who Proctor knows as Debs, and who Proctor and her sort of have a very spiky relationship, I would say. Really hate each other, as readers will discover as they read more, sort of why that's the case. But these two women really, really hate each other. And despite being very close friends for a period when they first met, when they were trainees at the farm and in their early years at CIA. And then Proctor has a group of friends who are kind of now, who had not left and then come back as kind of politicos, but she has friends inside Russia House, one by the name of Mac Mason, who was with her in Afghanistan, another named Gus Raptis, who is a kind of an agglomeration of different members of the Greek mafia at CIA, and then Theo Monk, who is, if it were possible, someone who drinks more than Artemis Proctor, is possibly more disgusting than Artemis Proctor, and has an addiction to many different things, but notably to the sort of husbandry of exotic tropical fish. And those are kind of the suspects, as it were, in this mole hunt, because as readers will discover, they all had kind of their fingerprints over this operation that Proctor was running at the beginning of the book to go meet this Russian. And when it goes sideways, she sort of has to work that trail back to figure out which one of these people may have compromised it.
And so, we go all over the place. Let's just talk briefly about, Proctor's such a sort of extreme character. How on earth do you kind of make her even more exotic with each passing? But you've managed that somehow by positioning her in the Everglades. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, so I did have, again, in this sort of mole hunt story, you're faced with a decision right off the bat, which is your investigator going to be inside the institution or outside the institution? And I would say, Mr. Le Carré made this decision in Tinker Tailor. I think most spy writers, I think of Matthew Richardson, I think he wrote a book called The Insider. It takes a similar tack, which is you find that the book is going to be a lot less fun if your mole hunter is an actual, sort of counter-espionage investigator inside the organization. So you put them outside because there are far more interesting hijinks to be had if you're sort of working against the institution. And you do see that, if you have a competent and loyal intelligence officer who thinks that the rot is so high up that it actually can't be investigated inside, you can very easily see how you get to a place where your character is making a kind of noble decision to continue the investigation illegally outside the organization. So I had to figure out, and this was quite fun, how do you fire Artemis Proctor, and then where do you put her briefly while she's been fired? And I had her fired, and I guess I don't know if I should say too much about it, but she has an accident while she's in the director's office, while she's being
we'll leave
let
that
go.
as a mystery to discover.
And which actually is the pull quote for this novel from a review that I'm most happy about, which is the New York Times did a very brief write-up of The Seventh Floor. And it was a fine review, but the part that I'm proud of is that they referred to that as a, quote, absolutely disgusting scene. So that is the New York Times quote that I will be most proud of for the rest of my days. So Proctor leaves CIA, or is fired, and I had to think about, well, what does a woman like Proctor do? What does a person like Proctor do when they get fired? Now, most case officers go and they work at a think tank or a university, or they do a consulting job for a massive corporation, or they put out their own shingle somewhere, or they go and they do training stuff at the farm, or with the director of operations in kind of a contract capacity. Well, Artemis Proctor is not normal, and I had to find something very not normal for her to do. And I remember writing, those were some of the first scenes I wrote. I said, I'm just going to put her I grew up for part of my childhood in Orlando, Florida. And I had been to Gator Land, which is an actual amusement park in Central Florida. And I thought, I will put her in a place like this. I will make it so that her family owns the third largest alligator-themed amusement park in Central Florida. And I'll just see how that kind of feels.
Is genius. I love that.
It's not the biggest.
It's not even a good one.
It's not even a good one. It's the third largest. And it just, to me, like, I don't know if, I'll be very curious to see just how it's received, because I suppose readers could think I've gone too far, but to me, it just worked with her character. Like, she is, as you said, like, such an extreme personality that, of course, it makes sense that she's wrestling gators and sort of, cleaning out, like chicken, carcasses with pounding a stick to get them out of the little, slats between the boardwalks, so it worked for me. I hope it works for everyone else, because I just had an absolute hell of a time writing those scenes. They were tremendous fun to write.
I think it's totally consistent with her character, and it's great fun. And there's also a parallel there. She's been kind of wrestling alligators all her life, hasn't she? To some degree.
There you go. Yeah.
We go from alligator farms to skulking around Langley and Washington, and then I mean, let's deal with the elephant in the room. I mean, you're pretty upfront about it. 4 suspects, a mole hunt, someone coming in from outside. This is an homage to Tinker Tailor. And
It is.
You kind of take that on, you take it and run with it. Tell us a little bit about how you decided, because there are some more than echoes here in various parts of it beyond the sort of big structure. And I mean, I think it's all absolutely fine. I enjoyed it hugely. But you were willing to be sort of upfront about how you did it. There's lots of little Easter eggs there for Tinker Tailor fans. Just tell us a bit about those.
Well, I chose to do it that way. I guess a couple of reasons I would say. One is, as I stepped into it, I realized why John le Carré had made many of the decisions he did, because I think this is like the way you tell a mole hunt story, in part. You're sort of bound by some of the actual mechanics of the counter-espionage work to begin with, in the same way that, if you're going to tell a story about, sort of the long con of an asset recruitment or something like that over time, there's sort of certain kind of natural laws you have to obey. And I also found, as I kind of think about one example, which is, okay, I have a character named Petra Devine, who's the sort of turned out old school counter-espionage investigator who's no one listened to, very much echoes of Connie Sachs. And yet, Petra was based on a CIA mole hunter named Jean Vertfoy, who uncovered Ames. And you find that, and I was fascinated by this because I thought, why are, a lot of these mole hunters are like, they've got kind of church lady vibes. They're older women who had been in the service forever, who know everything, who have no political antenna at all, and who are just deeply dedicated to the job. And it's actually like those are the people who are in these roles, in spy services. So there were just some interesting kind of, I think, realities of the work that I wanted to convey that I think, le Carré conveyed as well in Tinker Tailor. And then, I did want it to be an homage in many respects for a couple more reasons. One was Tinker Tailor to me I don't think it's my favorite le Carré novel, which is a hard thing to pick, but it's right up there. And it was a very formative book for me as I was being introduced to the genre in my younger years. And then 2, it's become such a part of not just the spy genre, but the way even, intelligence officers talk and think about the business that they're in, that I felt like it could legitimately sort of infuse the story a bit, even from the perspective of Proctor, who at one point is kind of ticking off the suspects, by putting their pictures on drink bottles.
Yeah, which is a nice Proctor way of doing the chess pieces.
And she's also sort of, in her own mind, she's like vaguely remembering that this happens in some other spy novel whose name she can't remember because it's so, it's so iconic that someone in the business would have heard of it. So I did want it to be kind of a tip of the cap. And then I love, I wanted to put Easter eggs in the book for people to kind of, tip my cap, but also, just frankly, as a measure of respect for the incredible impact that book has had on, I think, everybody writing in the genre today.
Yeah, and I think, you do even refer to the book at one point, in The Seventh Floor. So it kind of exists. Tinker Tailor exists in your universe as well.
That's right. In the world of The Seventh Floor, precisely. Yeah.
And have you had any feedback from the le Carré estate about any of that?
I've not. No, I'd be very curious if Nick Harkaway gets his hands on it at some point. I would love to know what he thinks about it. But I have, as of yet, heard nothing from the le Carrés.
But you've got to know Nick, I think. You did an event with him, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, we did an event through Barnes & Noble back in October, I think, which was wonderful, which was absolutely wonderful.
And then there's some other new characters in here. The sleepers.
Yeah.
It's a sort of, I guess it's a nod to something a bit like The Americans or sort of Matthew Quirk kind of conspiracy novel. As Proctor is searching, it obviously becomes clear to some of the people, that Proctor is searching and to the Russians. And you've got 3 other great new characters. There's Rem Zomov, who's your Russian, who I think comes with the kind of shades of grey people got to know from those Assad executioners in book 1. Everyone's kind of got some hinterland and a private life. And tell us a bit about him.
Yeah, so he, initially when I started writing the book, I thought, am I going to show any of the perspective on the other side, on the Russian side or otherwise? And I started to kind of dabble with his character, Rem Zomob's, and he really just came to life. And so I thought, I'm going to run with this guy because he's interesting. And he's a very, savvy Russian spy master. He works for the SVR, the Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. He essentially runs the mole, right? And so throughout the novel, he is trying to protect the mole, to keep the mole's identity from Proctor and her friend Sam. And I kind of liked, Rem isn't shy that he sits on top of a pretty brutal system. He understands that. At the same time, he's kind of a normal guy, right? He's older guy. He's on the cusp of retirement. He kind of, I think, sees the protection of this asset as part of his legacy. And, his wife wants him to just retire and be done with it. But he is such a workaholic and kind of addicted to the game that he can't. And so I think, you see hopefully in many of his scenes kind of like that he is at some degree. And I think you're right to make the comparison to like Ali Hassan from Damascus Station, that this is kind of a guy who's in some ways very normal. And if he were born in the States or in Britain, like he would, just kind of have a very normal job in some bureaucracy somewhere. But he just happens to be, running an asset in the SVR. So we got Rem Zomob in Moscow. And then, one of the things that I did want to do in the book, because I felt as I was writing that there are risks in a mole hunt story that you could be too procedural and it could be slow, maybe slower than I'd like. And I kind of like things to blow up at the end of my books. I have, I guess, a demonstrated track record of that. So I wanted Proctor to feel some heat. And what happens in this novel is that Rem activates two kind of illegals that the Russians have, this couple, they're a Dallas-based couple. And I live in Dallas. I basically thought of the most loathsome neighbors I could possibly imagine, and then wrote them into the book. This couple is kind of, they sort of volunteer, for Russia's intelligence services. They are Americans, but they're both sets of parents were born in Russia, and they begin to hunt Proctor in an extremely violent and also oftentimes quite incompetent way, because they are not trained at all. But they're on Proctor and Sam's heels for most of the kind of back 2/3 of the book.
Yeah, that's all great stuff. We'll come to Las Vegas in a moment. But the other thing I felt you did well with Rem is that I think he's got an analysis of America, which we don't often hear. Russia does, we look at Russia and we look at Putin and we think he's a sort of, neo-colonialist in some ways. He's a sort of power-crazed loon in some ways, malign in lots of ways. But I think through Rem, you kind of explain the Russian kind of worldview and how they see America. They see America as a sort of kind of corrupt and indulgent kind of place. But they've got a kind of inferiority complex about it as well. And they kind of know at some level that it's doing better than they are. I mean, to what degree do sort of American spies understand what motivates the people they're against? How often do they see them as professionals like that? And how much do they see them as, wicked people going around poisoning people or whatever? I mean, there's a subtlety there, which I guess must be shared in the community a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think, just to speak about it for a second as an analyst, I think, the job of the analysts working on, be it Syria or Russia or any other target, is to actually understand kind of why, a foreign actor, intelligence service leader does the things that they do. And so in that, I think there's some measure of kind of empathy that can be developed with these people, even if sort of the logic you might not agree with, or you might think the means of pursuing their goals are completely immoral or amoral or otherwise. I think there's a measure of sort of understanding why people do the things that they do that's critical to the job. So, I mean, I like to think, I was not a Russia analyst at CIA, but, I feel like I've kind of developed some of that skill over the years and like to apply it in the books to say, okay, well, how would in Damascus Station, how would a Syrian intelligence officer sort of be thinking about the world, right? How would Rem Zomov in this one be thinking about sort of not just the kind of tradecraft and the operational bits of running an asset inside CIA, but kind of the ethics of it, right? And the bigger purpose that it serves. So I think, I don't know, I always think those kind of characters, they they kind of, to some extent, can end up becoming more interesting in the books than even the CIA officers, because we're getting a light shed on something that we don't see, or it's being put in, it's not being written up in kind of like a somewhat anodyne or analytic piece that we're reading, in the paper, or frankly in an intelligence report. You're kind of, in this novel, you're getting a lot of that perspective just straight from Rem Zomov's mouth, which makes it maybe more impactful or more emotional as we kind of absorb it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what you say about showing people something they don't necessarily see. I mean, and I think anyone who's read the first two books, arguably particularly the first one, most people didn't know too much about Syria and what was going on in there, and that was the kind of great revelation of that. I think in Moscow X, you've got some great scenes in Russia, but you've also got a kind of introduction to the world of non-official cover and Knox and all that kind of thing, which the tradecraft there, and with a great sense of place at the branch and in the Russian scenes. Now you're writing about America, and was that different for you? We take a trip to Florida, we obviously see some Washington, we see some Texas, we see some Las Vegas, and in a sense, you've managed to make it relatively exotic, but it's still a place that your readers are much more familiar with, you're familiar with. Was that kind of harder to make it kind of sexy and interesting and still have that kind of travelogue or lifting the veil sense that you've been so good at with your other books?
Well, yeah, I think in this one, I mean, other than my successful attempt to get a sort of tax deductible trip to Las Vegas for the purposes of book research, which happened and was quite fun, and I think my liver is probably still recovering from to this day.
And was that a trip you took alone, David, or did Mrs. McCloskey get to come with you on that?
Mrs. McCloskey came along. I have a very dear friend from my consulting days who loves Las Vegas way too much for his own, sort of financial or moral health. And he took us along on an incredible kind of journey into the depths of Las Vegas. And, it's not...
And you were asking him questions, no doubt, in earshot of your wife. Really? I had no idea that happened. I fancy that, dear.
I had a notebook with me at the high-limit baccarat tables while he lost a tremendous amount of money, and we went to various nightclubs. And basically, if you read the Las Vegas scenes where Sam and Proctor go out there to try to interview this very psychotic Russian defector who, has a hard time focusing, let's just say, I basically just made my friend the defector, and then just, that scene just wrote itself. But you're right that I was worried that the kind of travelogue, as it were, was not going to be the this is the part you're getting under the hood, because in Damascus Station, in Moscow X, it's kind of like I'm trying to build a sense of place and really to make, sort of Damascus and Moscow, or more specifically even the horse ranch kind of characters in the book. I think in this one, the kind of analog is actually the CIA itself and the kind of culture, and ethos, kind of moral ethic of Langley, right? I think that is actually the piece of this that I'm hopeful kind of feels like it's a character in the novel.
You obviously took liberties in Damascus Station with a field officer having a relationship with one of his assets. I mean, you've talked in terms of the structure and why you made those decisions as an author to put Artemis outside, but we obviously learn a degree about how counterintelligence sort of work goes on. Does the agency use people from outside like that when they're sort of fearful of things at the top? Or I don't get the impression that Angleton was sort of subcontracting any of this work to anybody else in the 70s. I don't know if that's more of a feature these days, but is that true to life, or is that just a literary device ultimately?
Yeah, I think it's a literary device ultimately. I think all this stuff, I mean, I suppose it's possible that you could go out and try to find someone and bring them back in on a contract basis to do some of this, but my impression is that almost all of it is done by Blue Badgers, by staff inside our counterintelligence mission center. There are counterespionage and counterintelligence groups there that kind of do all of the insider threat work. I think that's a pretty sensitive, obviously, job, and I think it tends to be given to kind of in-house.
And what do people think of them? I mean, do they acknowledge the necessity, or are they regarded as the kind of enemy within, and it's a pain in the ass having to go and do another flutter and all that kind of thing?
Well,
just remind us how often you might, in a 10-year career, how often would you have the rule run over you properly by those kind of people?
Well, so this is the thing is that there is a difference between the people who are doing the like counter espionage investigatory work and the security people who are overseeing the general kind of recertification of everyone's clearances. So, I think you're supposed to get repolygraphed and reinvestigated every 3 to 5 years, something like that. I won't say it's cursory, but it doesn't have anything to do with, or might only lightly touch the kind of counter-espionage group. I would say, my experience was that you never knew that these people existed, period. And you'd have no interaction with them unless you were, in absolutely deep shit. And what they did was really separate from the work that almost everybody else at CIA is doing, and kind of not like they weren't this wasn't Mick Herron's Dogs, where they sort of have this kind of visible presence around. This is something that's happening off in its own silo. 99.9% of the workforce will never see these people or interact with them.
Yeah, David, I think that's a great rundown of this book and the choices you made. You made some other pretty big choices as an author, and I think what we'd like to do is say to people, go and read the book. This is fantastic. You can always, tell when you're in safe hands on page 1 of a McCloskey novel. People will have their favorites, but this is, a new classic of the mole hunt genre, and pretty well every new character I think is great fun to spend time with.
Thank you.
So, Spybrarians, if you haven't read it, go and read it, and then you might want to pick up here because we're going to do some spoilers now, and it's very important that you read the book before you listen to the rest of this stuff.
Yes, it is.
Yes. So let's go on. You obviously had to pick a mole, and then you had to pick an ending. And how did you go about picking your mole? Did you know who it was going to be at the start? To me, the major decision was it going to be Debs or not going to be Debs? Because I found her the most compelling of all the new ones, and there was obviously, if you think back to Smiley and Bill Hayden, they were the sort of mortal enemies because of what was happening with Anne. And your metaphor for that is entirely scatological and shows that actually the fault probably began with Artemis rather than with Debs. Debs really is only seeking revenge. But to me, that was the thing I was most interested in. And then you've obviously got these 3 guys who are all interesting in their own ways, but I don't feel like I kind of had a strong feeling about who it was or who it ought to be, really. I guess I felt who's the closest to her is probably the most painful, and I guess that's the decision you made. But is that how you came to decide who it was going to be, and how did you change? Did any of that change? You write the whole thing with that intention, or?
I wrote the whole thing with the intention that it would be Mac. I actually started with writing a vast number of scenes that never saw the light of day that had Proctor and Mac together, running operations in the past, hanging out, etc. And what quickly became apparent was that even though Theo Monk is this kind of, louche libertine character who, has tried to hit on Proctor for years and probably be fine to sleep with about anything that moves, he and Proctor don't have that kind of relationship. And at one point in the past, she and Mac did. And I think were romantically close in a way that they're not when the book is going, sort of the narrative of the book unfolds. And, to add on to that, I had written early on a scene where I knew I wanted, as hard as it would be to engineer in real life, I knew I wanted all of my characters to at one point have been in mortal danger together. And so there is a scene in Afghanistan where they are all out there for an asset meeting and things go horribly wrong. There's a shootout and Mac saves Proctor's life.
That was when I suspected Mac, if I'm honest.
Yes. No, that makes total sense.
I just thought, what is the most satisfying kind of way out of this? Yeah.
That's right.
He's the one who saves her life.
And it was a very hard kind of dance to engineer because for you as the reader to care who the mole is, I have to show, sort of emotional connection and depth between the mole hunter and the mole. And the more you do that, the more the reader suspects that person. So the more real estate you give in the novel to scenes with the mole hunter and the eventual mole, the more the reader suspects it. So I don't know if I got the balance right, but
I think you got it about right. Yeah,
at some point, most people will probably guess who it is before it happens, but, you kind of want it to be like only just before, as opposed to you're 20% of the way in. And I felt like with Debs, because there was some point in the kind of initial drafting where I thought, well, she's this obviously kind of wicked, terrible person who Proctor hates. Like maybe she should just be the mole. And I thought that it was maybe just too obvious that it would be
it would
her.
only have worked as double bluff, really. That it was
Right.
sort of obvious at the start, and then maybe you go elsewhere, and then you come back to. I
Right.
was wondering that's how it would pan out at one stage.
Right.
But,
so it felt like, and I hope there aren't actual clues in the novel. Now, there shouldn't be, if I've done my work, well, there shouldn't be a point where you say, oh, you can actually point to this in the chronology and say, okay, well, it was Mac, right?
No, I didn't work it out. I just thought, what would be the literally most satisfying way of doing this?
Exactly.
But as the lesson of a lot of mole hunt books is actually who it is doesn't matter nearly as much as why and how and what that then leads to. And in a sense, while this is a mole hunt book, the final impression it leaves you with is different, because that then has implications. Once she knows it's Mac, just take us through your thinking. Because those who are watching this know what happens, and essentially you've decided to kill off your lead from book one, Sam Joseph.
Yeah. I've gotten some...
How difficult was that?
I've gotten some, I would describe it as actual hate mail on that point. It was a very hard decision to make. I think I'll walk you through my thought process, because in the initial versions of this, Sam did not die. And I knew I wanted Mac to die. Proctor had to kill Mac. This was a belief I had very strongly as the author early on.
And that is entirely how she would behave in that situation, having been personally betrayed in that way, having had a deep connection, having thought that he was her closest friend, essentially.
And this was the other kind of wrinkle I tried to put in, which is, most mole hunts, or many mole hunts, end in a very unsatisfying fashion. It is very hard to actually prove that someone has committed espionage, and there are cases in the States where people have kind of been more or less run out of the service because everybody knows they've done something, but you can't quite prove it.
Kim Philby, anyone?
Kim Philby, anyone. There's a guy named Felix Bloch in the States who ended up getting run out of, I believe, the State Department, and then he was driving a bus in North Carolina, in his retirement, and everybody knew that he had committed espionage, but you couldn't quite prove it. The cases are very hard for the FBI to try. The way they do it is under the Espionage Act, which is a piece of legislation written in 1917, and you have to prove, intent to commit espionage, which basically means you have to catch someone in the act or on tape talking about what they've done. It's very hard to do. And so I wanted the case to I wanted my false ending, I guess, as it were, to get to a point where we all know who it is, and yet the powers that be at CIA, at Proctor, can't really do much about it other than to kind of shove this guy out. And then from there, I'm left with this choice of what happens between Proctor and Mac. And Proctor is nuts. She's not a sociopath. She is, a loyal CIA officer. And it was very hard for me to think about, even though I'd written the scene, it was it didn't work for Proctor to go to that length to go and kill Mac unless he had not only betrayed her, but sort of, really cost her the life of her dearest friend. And so, very unfortunately, because I wanted this book to end with her killing him, and I wanted that scene to be the one that kind of absolutely pops, both literally and figuratively, I felt like Sam had to die. And he had to die in sort of a causal chain you could link back to Mac's treason, so that Proctor would take the step of going, and killing the person who had been her dearest friend, Mac. And that's how I got to that.
Well, I think it's what lifts this from, a good book into a very, very good book, and it's certainly quite the ending. And it's what will leave people when they, do you find Artemis is just taking you places now? I mean, lots of authors say this, and non-authors never quite believe it, but she's got a life of her own now, hasn't she?
She does. She really does. And she'll definitely be back. She's one of those great characters that just kind of, she really does. You said it right. She's one of those characters where I could sit down and think this scene will have these 3 or 4 beats. This is how I'll get into the scene. This is how I'll get out of the scene. I have that in my head or kind of written down in a few words. And I'll start with Proctor and she'll just change it. We'll just go somewhere else. And it's usually delightful and insane and better than what I had initially thought. So when you have a character like that, those are the kind of, I think those are oftentimes the kind of people that we like to spend time with in the real world. As somebody who, you might go out for dinner with them and you don't know where the night is going to go. You just have no idea. Proctor is like that for a writer. So, I like to spend time with her.
So what's coming up? What's book 4? Is Proctor in that, or are we looking elsewhere?
Well, so Proctor is not in book 4. I have to say, I attempted to put her in it, and it just didn't work. And so she'll be back, but she's not back in book 4. Book 4 is a story. It's an Israel-Iran story, excuse me. And it's a story about essentially a war of assassinations between both sides. And the premise that I start with is that the Iranians have built a kind of set of assets inside Israel who are helping them conduct assassinations of senior Mossad officers in the same way that Mossad has been conducting assassinations of senior Iranian scientists and military officials and otherwise in Iran over the past 15 years. And so the Israelis are, of course, trying to figure out who's doing this and how do we stop them. And so it's this back and forth between both sides to determine, or to find out who's doing it and for the Israelis to try to stop them. So that one is, will likely, we don't have official dates yet, but I'm fairly certain it'll be out in the States in the fall, like September, October, and then out in the UK probably in January again.
Yeah,
like
so
a year from
similar schedule to what we've had with the previous ones. Yeah, great. And any update on sort of TV or film? You've had some options picked up. Where are we with any of that?
We have, yeah. So Damascus Station and Moscow X are under option, in development. The 7th Floor, we're just starting that process. So hopefully, we'll have some good news very soon. And like all things Hollywood at this point, it's very slow and uncertain. So, fingers crossed at some point, one of or both of those projects will sort of get greenlit into production.
This is feature film
going.
Or TV?
So Damascus Station would be for TV and Moscow X is in development as a film.
Very good. Well,
yeah,
that would
so
be
hopefully we'll have good
happens.
news. Yes, It would be a good thing, indeed.
Now, the ultimate question, I guess, is how much do I have to pay you and Mick Herron to get Artemis Proctor and Jackson Lamb in a book together? Because that is what I would most like to read.
That's what you'd most like to read. Well, I do wonder if there wouldn't be much of a book because by the 2nd chapter, they'd have killed each other or something like that. Like if you just couldn't get too far into that story without it being kinetic. I don't know. We need to talk to Mick about that idea. I think we need to run it by the master and see what he thinks. But yeah, I think there would be some violence early on in that story.
I think you're probably right. And you prefer your violence at the end of your story.
I know. I like it to happen at the end. I like it to kind of slowly build. This would be flipping that on its head.
Very good. David McCloskey, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back, and looking forward to hearing what Spybrarians think about the book. So it's wonderful.